All right, let's go to work, please. It is my ambition now to finish our observations regarding the Iliad. You should have in front of you now the purple textbook, page 77, or of course you could be working in the Fagel's translation from book 22. I'm going to stay though with page 77 in the purple book. I want to make the observation right away that the Iliad is a poem of violence. Page 77 is one.
This one is
Fitzgerald, right, that's right. I'm sorry, I said, that's why I said you could be here with me on page 77, or you could be with Fagel's in book 22. That is to say, have a comparative translation in front of you. But I'm going to go ahead and work with Fitzgerald. I appreciate that clarification. I want to point out for your notes right away that the Iliad is a poem of violence. But I want to have you jot down what kinds of violence do you find immediately in the Iliad. We normally have this tendency, for example, we're familiar with Brad Pitt's, film Troy. We are, of course, familiar with the idea of the physical violence. So let's go ahead and just list that one, physical violence. And obviously that's going to happen. And there's no doubt in the Iliad that you're familiar with a number of moments of physical violence. Some will argue that whoever wrote this poem clearly spent time on the actual battlefield, the way that there's these extreme descriptors of the way people die, the blood and the way it exits the body and all of that. But I want to work with other kinds of violence. Other kinds of violence. Go ahead and jot down, what are other kinds of violence? Klingler said vocal.
I said vocal.
Let's give it an academic language though, and let's call it linguistic violence. You got it. Let's call it linguistic violence. Excellent. So let's talk about linguistic violence. Obviously, Ms. Damiano was suggesting as well that there's a whole lot of sexual violence, either exactly that way or implied, right? We kind of understand what really they're fighting over for Briseis. Let's make it clear. It's not like Achilles wants to marry this girl. Sorry about the movie. The movie The Troy Tale seems to suggest, or Troy seems to suggest maybe a little otherwise, that somehow Achilles is really into this girl. Probably not from our reading of the Iliad. It's more about what
He loves her.
his pride or whatever, right, we might say. What other kinds of violence? What other kinds of violence? What other kinds of conflict? Linguistic violence, sexual violence, physical violence. Any others that you want to talk about?
Violence. Your kind of violence.
Violent violence.
Say it what?
Kind of stupid violence.
So violence. Well, think about it for a moment. What do you want to call when you are desiccating and desecrating a dead body? Hello, it's not like come on, it's not like Patroclus is going to feel any more pain after he's dead.
Posthumous violence.
Keep going. Why would he do this? Why would Hector, some will call it emotional, keep going. It's psychological violence, very good, let's write it down. There's a lot of psychological violence. It's not unlike when a victor taunts the vanquished, right? What is it that Emily Dickinson said last year in Success is Counted Sweetest? Not one of all the purple host who took the flag today can tell the definition so clear of victory as he, remember, defeated, dying on whose ear, right? The distant strains burnt agonized and clear. Remember that? In other words, remember she said that it's not the winner who knows about winning, it's the loser who knows about winning, especially when hearing the chants like, we're number one, we're number one. I want to go to now passage 22, book 22. And I want to actually take a look now at some of the language of book 22. And I want to point out the ways in which some of these kinds of violences that we just listed join together, kind of come together. Read with me page 77. Finally, Hector will turn, and he will face his adversary Achilles. He's been running from him, now he's going to turn, and they're going to come face to face. And Hector will speak first. He will say the following: I will no longer fear you as before, son of Peleus, though I ran from you round Priam's town 3 times and could not face you. Now my soul would have me stand and fight, whether I kill you or am killed. Notice here, Hector admits fear is the reason he ran, right? Even though he knew he was going to have to do this fight, still fear for him is the great challenge to overcome. And he says, finally, I did it. I've overcome my fear. Keep going. So, come. We'll summon the gods here as our witnesses, none higher arbitrators of a pact. So let's make the second observation. He says, let's make a deal. Now, put in your notes, please, at 3a, that philosophically, we will be talking later about the great Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the great French philosopher, who in his classic philosophic text, Social Contract, says the following: human beings get along because they agree to get along. They're not maybe by nature hardwired to get along, but they agree to get along through what he called a social contract, where we all kind of agree that we're going to take care of each other, even though we're maybe not naturally hardwired to do so. Hector will ask Achilles for a deal. Hey, I know we're about to fight to the death. Let's make a deal, a contract. Keep going. A pact. I swear that terrible as you are, I'll not insult your corpse. By the way, there's another kind of violence. We were talking about it. That's that psychological violence. He says, I won't insult your corpse. The only reason Hector would have dragged the body of Patroclus around the battlefield would be to jack the living Greeks. And maybe as a primary insult to Achilles himself. You're not man enough to wear your own uniform and come out and fight. I'm going to jack your best friend, some translations, your lover. The debate about whether Patroclus and Achilles are bedmates versus warrior mates is, of course, one that is difficult for a Greek audience to understand, and here's why. From the time they were very young, Greek troops were taught to fight, much like Roman troops, to fight in pairs. This would make sense if you'll think about it, because hand-to-hand combat, if you saw films like Gladiator and Braveheart, those fighting scenes, you know that fighting happens all around you. And the easiest way to lose is to have one of your arteries cut from behind. The way most men died in battle and hand-to-hand combat was actually a cut to the back of the leg. A large artery runs down the back of the leg. It does not take much to be able to find that artery and cut it. And once it's cut, you're only good for a few more seconds, right? Once that artery is severed, it's done. And it's very difficult in the back of the leg to find any way to fix that. That's one of the larger arteries. So the swords were used not to stab into each other, but rather to find the back of legs. So your back was the most vulnerable place you could be. And so young men were taught from a very young age to fight two to a side. The phrase, I've got your back, is an ancient phrase. What it means is, I defend while you defend, and that's kind of the relationship of Patroclus and Achilles. There is something to be said then for Achilles allowing Patroclus to leave his tent at all and go and fight without him there. There is something to be said for him allowing him to wear his own uniform, that is to say his warrior's armor. And this is the point that's being made here by Hector right away. Notice, I swear that terrible as you are, I'll not insult your corpse should Zeus allow me victory in the end. Notice who gets blamed for the victory as well as for the loss. It's Zeus. He says, if I win, it's going to be because Zeus allows it. If I lose, it's going to be because Zeus willed it. We're back to the opening lines of the Iliad again. Notice he says, and your life as prize once I have your gear. Now, for those of you that watch international soccer, some of you have maybe wondered, why is it at the end of the game that jerseys are exchanged? This happens often in international contests in soccer. It's the world's game, obviously. Why is that the case? And the answer is, it's a very ancient tradition that started actually on the battlefield. When you defeated your adversary, you took his armor. Later, of course, there would be the taking of body parts, whether that would be ears or the scalp or any other number of other body parts that would be taken. Of course, in extreme examples, it was to take your enemy's heart. You literally cut the physical heart out of your enemy, and in so doing, You gained your enemy's power, and you also, of course, took away his ability to have any power, right? And here, notice, he says, one or two of us is going to end up with each other's gear. I'm just asking that we have an agreement about how we're going to work that out. Keep reading. I'll give your body back to Achaeans. Grant me to, look what he calls it, this grace. That is to say, favor. In other words, even though we're mortal enemies, let's come together and agree how the rules of this fight are going to go. Top of page 78. But notice the adjectives when you read the Iliad. Always important. Swift Achilles frowned at him and said. Now this is interesting because Achilles is often referred to as frowning. He is pictured as a pouter, frowner, morose. Later, when we look at, for example, the Bronte novel Wuthering Heights, I'm working 3A again, we'll make a note that Heathcliff is an Achillean figure. When we look at Lord Byron's Byronic Man, he is an Achillean figure. When we say someone is Achillean, we usually mean two things about them. One, they're an angry person. Two, they're kind of a morose person. They're not a happy person. They are kind of pictured as always being, well, the glass is always half empty, never half full. They're going to look at any situation as being something's wrong with it. And with the exception of that little mini Olympics that happens at the very end of the Iliad, where Achilles kind of oversees that, we don't see Achilles smiling very much. Here, notice he's frowning, and now he speaks. Notice, the Iliad is a poem predominantly of linguistic violence, not physical violence. In other words, a passage that tells, like I'm giving you an example here, a passage that tells a physical contest where guys are fighting against each other will have a preambulation of sometimes 100 or 200 lines of poetry where they talk about what they're going to do before they actually do it. If you've watched guys in physical contests of fighting, you oftentimes will see this. Very regularly, if there's a fight, for example, in a school, it does not start immediately with physical altercation. It usually begins with, are you looking at me? Are you saying that to me? And it starts that way, with pointing, with gesticulating, and then with maybe a touch. So, for example, a touch on the chest, right? You know, and the minute that the touch happens, now things start to escalate, right? We've got the escalation. By the way, I said guys. I guess I should have said girls as well. We can have fights with girls as well. Yes. Now we're going to have the response. Let's read it. I'm on page 78. Hector, he says, I'll have no talk of pacts with you, forever unforgiven as you are. A really important film by Clint Eastwood that will win the Academy Award, and some argue the single greatest Western film ever made is called Unforgiven. If you've not seen it, I recommend it to you. And the author of that text, that screenplay, is in fact thinking about this very line in the translation that will be provided here. Notice what Achilles says to Hector. You are not just unforgiven, forever unforgiven. What does the word forever mean to you here? What does eternal? Keep going. Forever unforgiven. What is his point?
Even when he dies.
It doesn't matter. Even when you die, you are still guilty of my pal Patroclus' blood. I will never let it go. In other words, let's point this out. This fight, he says it out loud, this fight isn't going to resolve anything. That's what Achilles is saying. It doesn't matter that I'm going to kill you. It doesn't resolve anything. I will forever in my life. Now, why, Mr. Kelleher, might Achilles feel a little bit responsible for the death of Patroclus and therefore have this feeling that even if he kills and avenges the death, he's still going to feel guilty about it? How come? Why do you think? Mr. Kelleher, why do you think? Why would he maybe continue to feel this sense of guilt? Yeah. He's, in some ways, he's responsible for the death of his lover, the death of his pal. We would say it as pal, best friend, right? And to that degree, He's not able, he's not going to fix this. He's not going to fix this. And yet, keep reading, here we go. By the way, for those of you who like to think that the history of international conflict can be resolved through treaties and the United Nations and work like that, we're going to get a poet who will suggest otherwise. Let's take a look at it. These lines will become remarkably philosophic and political right away. Look what he says. As between men, notice this extended simile, a comparison using like or as. As between men and lions, there are none, that is, no concord, between wolves and sheep, but all hold one another hateful through and through, so there can be no courtesy between us, no sworn truce, till one of us is down and glutting with his blood the war god Ares. Two observations. The observation one, there is a natural conflict, bellicosity, struggle, tension between certain phenomena of nature, and you can't change that, right? Wolves will always jack the sheep. No matter how much the sheep back, doesn't matter. Why? Because a wolf is hardwired to kill the sheep. In the same way that a lion and a man never gets along. This is, of course, before the notion of taming lions, so you could put them on a stage in Vegas or whatever. Right. But you understand the point he's making. In other words, for human beings to resolve conflict is unnatural. That's what he says. Unnatural. Now we're going to make a distinction between an Achillean kind of figure and an Odyssean kind of figure. Odysseus is a man who likes to try to come to agreements if he can. He likes to use language as a way to do that. We'll see this in the Odyssey. Achilles, however, notice the kind of person he is. You insulted me, now I'm going to avenge. Done. We're going to do this thing, and there will be no concord. Part 2. Did you see what he says will be the only way he can feel satisfied? Notice it's not that he kills him. Did you see what he says? Go back and look at it again. What does he say will only be the thing that will satisfy him and, of course, the great god of war, Mars or Ares? What is it? You got to actually take his blood out of his body, to glut oneself in it, to actually bathe in the blood of your enemy. This is again suggesting body parts will be taken, namely maybe even an internal body part, of course predominantly the heart itself. In other words, Achilles will say in the most graphic language, the most potentially violent language possible, no way, no way. I am making no agreements with you of any kind. Notice Achilles is assuming something. What is he assuming? He assumes he will win, right? He doesn't assume. There is no doubt in his mind he's going to be the victor here. Of course, we're reading a Greek poem. So it's obvious that, yeah, you're right. It's true that Achilles is probably the winner. That's the whole point of him being the hero, the epic hero. Let's finish now quickly. By God, you'd better be a spearman and a fighter. Now there is no way out. Pallas Athena will have the upper hand of you. Notice it's Achilles who blames it on a god, but it's a different god. In other words, you insulted Athena all those years ago. Of course, it wasn't Hector. It was his brother, Paris, right? But nonetheless, you're all in this together. You insulted Athena. Notice it's not you took Helen, Menelaus's wife. No. It's you insulted Athena, and that's why all this is happening. In other words, the Greeks always had an excuse or a reason for the things that happened, and it was because of the will of the gods. Now, whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, we'll obviously debate. Keep reading to finish. The weapon belongs to me. You'll pay the reckoning in full for all the pain my men have borne who met death by your spear. Wait a minute. The poem opens by saying all of Achilles' Greek pals die because of Achilles' wrath. Notice what Achilles says here. you are going to pay for the death of all those Greek troops. Wait a minute. All those Greek troops wouldn't have died if who was in the war? Right. So here again, notice, you've got a situation psychologically, Freud made much of these lines, that psychologically, you have a man who feels tremendous guilt for the fact that A, he allowed his ego to be wounded enough that he pulled from the battle, and a lot of Greek troops died. We know that from the opening lines of Iliad 1. And then B, the very man who was his closest pal, his dearest brother, he dies because Achilles refuses to fight. And now Hector will become the scapegoat. He must die so Achilles can somehow feel that it was okay. Of course, what do you kind of get a sense of psychologically? Is this going to work for him or no? Yeah, see, you kind of get a sense of it. This is not going to purge the anger, the rage, the moroseness that defines this epic hero Achilles. And let's point out, this is an interesting hero. He's a complicated hero. He's not an easy hero. This is no black and white heroic kind of villain type of person. It does beg an interesting question. Why is it after the Brad Pitt film Troy did so many people say they had a hard time pulling for Achilles when he finally met Hector at the walls of Troy? Because that's the brilliance of this poem. You don't so easily pull for one or for the other. It's a complicated kind of poem in that regards, even though it's an ancient poem. The Iliad, Book 1 to Book 22, about linguistic violence and the ways in which words lead to actions, but don't always mirror. They don't necessarily mirror. Achilles will kill Hector, but we get a sense it isn't going to be the kind of reward that he's hoping for. Ultimately, Achilles will have a final moment where he will return the body of the slain Hector back to Hector's father Priam in a moment of what the poet tells us is empathy. He has a moment, an insight of empathy, which is interesting, taken the lines, forever unforgiven as you are. Thank you. I'll see you back on Tuesday.